The suburban bus was following its usual route. It was mostly filled with elderly people, women, and children. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, smiled discreetly, and continued driving. He loved his job and never complained about the difficulties associated with it. In the summer, driving the bus was easy and simple. But in winter, when the road was icy and it was snowing, everything became much more challenging. Isaac Thomas had been working as a driver on this route for about 15 years and knew many of the passengers. He never had any problems with them, and the atmosphere on his bus was always peaceful. Moreover, Amanda Gomes, a ticket inspector, was also on the bus with him. She was a great help in maintaining order. Unfortunately, that day went wrong from the very beginning. The 4th of July was approaching, and people were traveling to visit their relatives and friends, taking advantage of the time off work. The atmosphere on the bus was very festive. Children were squealing joyfully, while adults were either looking out the window or dozing off, lulled by the rhythmic noise of the engine. Working in such an environment was a true pleasure. But what happened next changed the situation completely. It all started when a group of loud young people burst into the bus at one of the stops. There were 6 of them. Their characteristic clothing, jewelry, and dense network of tattoos on their arms indicated that they were likely members of a street gang. There we go, now they'll start causing trouble. Why did they have to get on my bus? Alfred thought, getting worried. The experienced driver knew that being outside the city limits, he and his passengers were more vulnerable. The young men were behaving rowdily, and since there weren't enough empty seats for all of them, they shooed a couple of kiddos and took their seats. It was completely inappropriate, and Alfred understood it better than anyone else. On the other hand, what could he do to those insolent young men that had strength, confidence, and the audacity on their side? Alfred didn't want to escalate the situation and silently prayed to God that the ticket inspector would think the same way. But Amanda decided differently. Seeing that the group of young men didn't pay the fare, she got visibly nervous and stood up from her seat. Alfred turned pale. He knew that Amanda would insist on them paying their fare, and if they didn't do it, she'd start ensuing fines. That was what Alfred feared the most, since no one could predict how the situation would develop in such a case. But there was no stopping Amanda. Having approached the group of young men, she introduced herself and politely asked them to pay the fare. Alfred tensed up noticeably and gripped the steering wheel, preparing for the worst. The man understood that such unruly passengers could ruin the trip not only for him, but for everyone on the bus. And he didn't want that. Amanda's question elicited a smirk from the young men. Pay the fare? Are you out of your mind? We're doing just fine without it. Why would we want to pay anything? Well, there you go, Alfred thought sadly. Laughing infectiously, the young men immediately started joking and behaving as if the bus belonged to them alone. If you don't pay for the ride, I'll have to issue a fine, Amanda mumbled. A fine? You can issue anything you want, but we won't pay anything, one of them replied, now more rudely. He seemed larger than all the others and apparently was the leader. Amanda's lips started trembling treacherously and sweat appeared on her forehead. How's that? What do you mean you won't pay? The transportation company has its rules, and they are mandatory for all the passengers without exception. The young man smirked. I don't care about those rules. I decide what to do in any given situation. We won't be paying for the ride. And why should we anyway? The bus is old. It might fall apart at any minute now. Such audacity took Alfred's breath away. Who did this punk think he was? What right did he have to criticize the transportation that had been faithfully serving people for years? The situation became critical. Amanda simply didn't know what to do and stepped aside. There was no way she could deal with 6 aggressive men, especially considering there were almost no men on the bus. She didn't take the driver into account, as he was almost 60 years old. How could he take on those aggressive young men who were clearly looking for trouble? The situation became truly critical. Feeling their impunity, the young men began to behave even more defiantly. Now they weren't afraid to pick on other passengers and acted as if they were the true owners of the universe. Of course, Alfred couldn't stand aside and attempted to confront the troublemakers. Unfortunately, it didn't have any effect on them. The young men just laughed at the driver and advised him to focus on the road. Alfred silently swallowed his pride and got quiet, understanding full well that he couldn't stand up to their youthful strength at his age. At that moment, the next bus stop appeared around the bend, where an elderly man with a canvas bag in his hands was waiting. Upon seeing him, the leader of the group shouted, "Let's keep going. Why should we stop to pick up this old man? Let him wait for the next bus." Alfred shook his head, but didn't comply with the young man's request. The thing was, he picked up this passenger at this stop almost every day and couldn't afford to just leave him there. Alfred knew that this man lived in the suburbs, where he had a small house with a garden and flower beds. He went into the city to work as a guard at one of the trading firms, which was why he was forced to use public transportation. The man's name was James White, and he seemed like a sweet old man, radiating kindness and care for others. Having gotten on the bus, Mr. White nodded to the driver and habitually headed to his favorite seat by the window. But now it was taken by one of the young men from the street gang. "What are you looking at, old man?" "Something bothering you?" the young man said. Mr. White coughed awkwardly and said, "No, I'm all good, young man, but it wouldn't hurt for you to become more respectful." The young man became animated and exchanged meaningful glances with his friends. "Oh, I see you're feeling rather confident. What's in your bag, old man?" the young man asked rudely. Mr. White grimaced but didn't avoid the question. "Apples from my garden and some peaches." The young man chuckled. "Wow, that's some treat you brought us. Come on, open your bag, old man. You won't take anything home anyway. Consider it payment for the ride." Mr. White looked around, handed his bag to one of the passengers, and walked towards the young men standing in the aisle. As he walked, his shoulders straightened and he seemed to have grown taller. But Amanda was the only one who noticed it. The poor woman genuinely feared for Mr. White's life and well-being. Seeing the approaching man, the gang leader grinned maliciously. "What do you want, old man? You want trouble? Well, you're gonna get it right now." At the next moment, he swung to deliver a hefty slap to the old man, but he couldn't do it because he received a powerful blow to the side. Having lost his balance, the gang leader tumbled into the bus aisle. Mr. White ignored him and continued his counterattack. Blow after blow, he made his way to the end of the bus like an icebreaker. Surprised passengers sat with mouths agape. Mr. White skillfully delivered punches without causing any real harm to the young men. Why hurt the younger generation? They would grow up, reconsider their actions. They might even become good people someday. Mr. White didn't harbor any anger towards his opponents. His breathing was steady, and his heart was beating in the same rhythm as before the scuffle. It took him just a couple of minutes to calm down all 6 of the young men. Everything happened so quickly that involuntary witnesses joyfully applauded the unfolding drama. Children giggled, and their parents admired Mr. White, who had become their hero in an instant. Once they got quiet, Mr. White helped the young men up and directed them to the empty seats. "Well, old man, who knew you could do that? Are you Superman or something?" one of them asked with undisguised respect. Mr. White smiled. "No, of course not. I was the winner of the Golden Gloves competition back in my day. Ever heard of it? It was a long time ago when boxing was a way to survive in troubled city neighborhoods. In my youth, I was just like you, robbing and stealing. And then, what happened then?" the gang leader couldn't resist asking. "And then I ended up in a school for troubled teens. Essentially, it was a prison for juvenile delinquents. I started boxing there. My coach was a very good man who once fought against many celebrities of his time. Later, I followed in his footsteps. My career didn't pan out, but before leaving, I did manage to make a stir in the welterweight division," Mr. White replied proudly. A tense silence settled in the bus after the old man finished his story. Each passenger was thinking about the fact that they were traveling with a real champion. He might not have won many championships, but that didn't make him any less talented. After the conversation with Mr. White, the young men got noticeably calmer and stopped harassing the other passengers. Apparently, the notion that kindness should be backed up with fists worked this time. Meanwhile, Mr. White picked up his bag and headed towards the exit. Watching him leave, each of the bus passengers mentally wished him health and many years of life. As for the members of the youth gang, no one saw them after that incident. Rumor had it that they gave up their life of crime, and following Mr. White's example, joined a boxing club. Sooner or later, you might see one of them in the international arena, illuminated by the flashes of photographers and fans.